American intelligence establishment. Veil by Bob Woodward.
That Casey made a so-called deathbed confession of knowledge about the diversion
Later,
of
the book
Iranian
says the CIA tapped the phones of President Hosni Mubarak.
It was a bungled attempt to kill Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah.
The CIA infiltrated Anwar Sadat's personal staff and knew he had a drug problem.
Our guests tonight, author Bob Woodward, the late CIA Director William Casey's widow, Sophia Casey, former CIA Director Richard Helms, former CIA Deputy Director Bobby Inman, Republican Senator William Cohen, Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the committee's former Vice Chairman, Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Writing a non-fiction book about the CIA is destined to be an exercise in frustration. The better the book, the closer it comes to touching on the truth, the more it will be denounced by those who are charged with keeping and safeguarding U.S. secrets. By that standard alone, the firestorm of criticism that is being leveled at Bob Woodward's book, Veil, suggests that he has cut very close to the bone indeed. Of course, there is another possibility. Sometimes when a book is the product of sloppy or dishonest reporting and research, then the criticism is legitimate. You will hear both arguments made. In this case, fueled on the one hand by Bob Woodward's reputation as perhaps the premier investigative reporter of his generation, and on the other hand by this nagging question: why would William Casey, while still in office as Director of Central Intelligence, unburden himself of so much extraordinarily sensitive, highly classified material to, of all people, Bob Woodward of the Washington Post? Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield reminds us what William Casey did say when he was on the record.
In recent years, publication of classified information by the media has destroyed or seriously damaged intelligence sources of the highest value. Leakers are costing the taxpayer millions and even billions of dollars, and more important, putting Americans abroad, as well as our country itself, at risk.
In the audience of newspaper editors that heard William Casey make that charge was Bob Woodward, the Washington Post's premier investigative reporter, whose stories revealing government secrets often trigger the wrath of public officials. So it must be considered a supreme irony that Casey himself, arch enemy of the leak, may have been a major source for Woodward's new book, Veil. According to Woodward, he met or talked with the late CIA director dozens of times about the work of the agency during Casey's years.
If Director Casey was, in fact, meeting regularly with Mr. Woodward and talking with Mr. Woodward about covert actions, then I would deem that a very serious breach of the responsibilities of the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
I would deem that a breach of security, and I hope he did not do it.
My husband would never talk to him about his work. My husband never talked about anybody about his work.
Did he talk to you about it?
No, never.
I think that there's an awful lot of fiction about a man who was unable to communicate at all and is now being quoted as if he were doing nothing but talk his head off.
The most sensational and hotly disputed assertion by Woodward is that he was in the dying Casey's hospital room earlier this year and, with a nod of the head and a few words, Casey confirmed that he knew that Iran arms sales profits had been diverted to the Contras in Nicaragua.
This is absolutely a lie. He never got to see Bill Casey.
Governor Reagan is the only man in America who's ever turned the government around.
Woodward's book contains other eye-opening assertions. That Casey, who was Reagan's 1980 campaign manager, considered the president lazy, detached, passive. That Saudi King Fahd violated Muslim tenets by drinking heavily. That Egypt's late President Anwar Sadat was a drug abuser. That Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi dressed in women's clothing. And that Casey had worked through Saudi intelligence to arrange a March 1985 car bombing at the headquarters of Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, the leader of the Party of God. That bombing, in retaliation for alleged terrorist acts, missed Fadlallah but killed 80 people. But Woodward is after bigger game than gossip or sensationalism. William Casey came to the CIA in 1981 as part of an administration determined to reassert American interests, convinced that the Congress and the press were hindering the legitimate work of intelligence, and convinced that covert action by the United States was a critical tool in a worldwide struggle. According to Woodward, the near-fatal shooting of President Reagan only 10 weeks into his term demonstrated the vulnerability of American interests to violent attack. The 1983 bombing of the American embassy in Beirut and the slaughter of 241 American Marines in Beirut that same year reinforced the administration's determination to strike back at terrorists. In Nicaragua, Casey saw the struggle of the anti-Sandinista rebels, the Contras, threatened by vacillation in Congress and by inertia in the State Department. Indeed, from Central America to the anti-Soviet resistance in Afghanistan, to Jonas Savimbi's anti-Marxist guerrillas in Angola, William Casey saw a worldwide anti-communist struggle he was determined to assist.
The director was interested in the ability to go to an existing, as he put it, off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, stand-alone entity that could perform certain activities on behalf of the United States.
It was that impulse, according to Woodward, that led Casey to tap Prince Bondir, Saudi ambassador to the United States, for money to pay for counter-terrorist operations and to fund the Contras after Congress said no. It was that conviction, according to Woodward, that led Casey to embrace the use of private operatives in the arms for hostages dealing with Iran, doing an end run around Congress and of much of the executive branch as well. And that led Casey to embrace the diversion of Iran arms profits to help the Nicaraguan rebels, what Casey is said to have called the ultimate covert operation. But why would Casey, along with countless high-ranking intelligence professionals, have revealed so much to an investigative reporter? Out of affection? Not according to a Casey ally.
Bill Casey expressed to me a conviction that the book would be very negative, because Woodward was very negative, and he made very clear he didn't trust Bob Woodward at all. He said some rather uncomplimentary things about him, in fact.
Then why talk at all?
Oh, I think because in a democracy it is terribly important to have accurate public understanding of public policy, and it's very important for public officials, I think, to discuss public policy with reporters.
Thomas Powers won a Pulitzer Prize for his book on the CIA.
It sometimes appears, when a reporter writes a story, that somebody has come to him with the whole thing and laid it out for him and explained all the details and handed him the story. That very, very rarely happens. And it's the same the case as well with the CIA. You don't get a CIA story whole. You figure it out, you do a lot of reporting, you ask a lot of questions, and maybe at some point you talk to somebody like Casey, and Casey makes a few remarks, and you fit those into the mosaic of the whole story.
And the questions keep coming. How much did Bill Casey really reveal to Bob Woodward? How much was information? How much was disinformation designed to conceal rather than reveal embarrassing facts? Was Bill Casey, the passionate advocate of American national interests, serving or disserving those interests by what he did? And where does a journalist's instinct to get out all the facts conflict with larger interests of security? These are all simply more reminders that in the shadow world of intelligence, the only certainty is uncertainty. This is Jeff Greenfield for Nightline.
When we come back, we'll be joined by Bob Woodward.
In Canada, where inching your way up 12,000 feet in the Canadian Rockies is some people's idea of social climbing. You don't make a faint-hearted light beer. Now there's imported Molson Light. Canadian taste has finally come to life.
A well-known investment firm kept up with world markets by phoning international sources. One Mr. David King, however, phoned more often, getting the jump on international information that did his clients a world of good. When AT&T asked the reason for his increasing number of happy investors, his driver said, "He's talking to Hong Kong. Try him at home." From equipment to networking, from computers to communications, AT&T is the right choice.
On 2020's New Night Friday, a major expose. The VA, created to help the veteran. Thousands claim it's become the enemy. Watch 2020 Friday.
Bob Woodward's new book is hardly his first venture into investigative reporting. He is known internationally for his coverage with Carl Bernstein of the Watergate scandal. and he currently heads the investigative staff at the Washington Post. Bob Woodward joins us now here in our Washington Bureau. And from our New York studios, Sophia Casey, the widow of CIA Director William Casey, who has challenged Woodward's account of his last meeting with her husband as a fabrication. Bob, before we get any further into this, just give us a sense of context. You've told me you had more than 4 dozen meetings. I think you even said more than 50 meetings with Director Casey. What are you counting as meetings? I mean, would a brief social contact in which you exchange a few words be a meeting?
Meetings or substantive discussions. Sometimes those were at parties, half hour in the corner at a New York Times party, for example.
How many substantive discussions would you say you had?
Well, they were all substantive.
All 50?
Indeed.
Now, that last meeting, and I draw your attention and also our viewers' attention in particular to a picture which we took from Newsweek of Director Casey sitting in a chair and you sitting in a chair hunched over and listening. Is that in fact the way that it was? Is that an accurate representation?
That is some artist at Newsweek that did that. What I have decided on that issue is to not go beyond what is in the book. That is the best account, the time I wrote it and edited it, and that's what happened.
Well, the reason I draw your attention and the viewers' attention to it is precisely because in almost every other respect, you are a very descriptive writer. But when it comes to that particular scene, which after all is a very dramatic scene and the one with which you close your book, there is no description at all. None. None about the way he looked, really, none about where he was. Was he in bed? Was he in a chair? No description of the room at all. It is almost totally devoid of anything other than this brief dialogue that you held, a dialogue in which body language plays almost as much of a role as what was said. Why did you leave out any kind of description?
Because the 19 words he said to me, the nod, the smile, kind of a half smile at one point, were what was important.
And whether he was in bed or sitting up, I mean, to me, it's fascinating, and I'm told that the Newsweek artist got this indirectly, not from you directly, but from someone who worked for you, a description of what the setting was like. If the man was well enough to be sitting up, that clearly says something. If he was lying in bed, that says something else. If he was on a life support system, that says one thing. If he is completely without a life support system, as he is in that sketch, that also says something else. Which was it?
I am not going to go beyond the book, and I need to give you the reason why. There are people who want to find out who assisted me, who gave me the opportunity to talk to Mr. Casey. Those people have to be protected, and I have heard stories that people are being interrogated and affidavits are being sought and so forth, and I, as is, I think, well demonstrated over the years, want to protect sources. Those sources are my connection to the best version of the truth, and if there is some sort of hunt going on, it is my job to thwart it.
Well, I'm not exactly sure I understand why a description of the director's condition at that point would point a finger in anyone's direction, but after all, we do have another eyewitness to that, Mrs. Casey. Mrs. Casey, where was your husband at that time? Was he able to sit up in those days, or was he in a bed? Was he on a life support system, or oxygen, or intravenous?
He was mostly in bed. He would get up for a short period of time.
So he was capable of sitting up in a chair at that time?
No, he could not sit up. He sort of reclined.
Well, when you say he was capable of getting up for short periods, I don't mean to probe too much, but would he, as for example that picture depicted, would he have been capable at that time of sitting up in a chair?
No, not that way. I saw the picture. He never sat up that straight. He was sort of half lying down, and they would just put him in the chair to change his position, and he really didn't sit up.
Was he on intravenous at all? Was he on oxygen at all?
He had intravenous sometimes, yes.
But I mean, on the particular day in question, and you know when...
What day was that?
Well, the day that Mr. Woodward claims that he went to see your husband.
What date was that?
Bob Woodward, what date was that?
Well, again, as I indicated, people are conducting their examination of not only the person who helped me get into the hospital, but the 250 people I talked to for this book. And by narrowing the date, which I would love to give, that makes it much easier for them to narrow who might have assisted me.
All right, the first time you tried to get in, I believe, was January 22nd, wasn't it?
That is what the CIA has said.
And that's the date that's mentioned in your book, is it not?
I did not mention the date in my book.
All right, but one can assume, I suppose, Mrs. Casey, that it was sometime after late January.
Well, the newspaper said January 22nd.
That was the first time, yeah.
That was the first time that he was thwarted. And then he said he went 4 days later, which would make it January 26th.
Right. Now, at that time, was your husband on some kind of a life support system, intravenous?
I don't remember. I don't remember that.
Let me just ask you, because you have denied categorically that it would be possible for Mr. Woodward to have seen your husband. How can you be so sure? I mean, I know you and your daughter kept a watch there with him, but surely there must have been some times when you were not there.
Never. When we were there, we were there. We never had to leave the room. We had our food brought into us. It was a bathroom in there, so we never had to leave the room.
You say when you were there, but I mean over a period of weeks. Are you saying that one or the other of you was there 24 hours a day?
We were there. I was there from all night, and my daughter was there all day.
Let me just, and we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back to both of you, but let me just ask you one broader question. You're not denying, are you, that Bob Woodward met on many occasions with your husband and had long conversations with him?
Yes, I'm denying that.
You're denying that he had any conversations?
No, I'm denying that he had 40 conversations or 48 conversations.
Well, how many would I mean, as you heard, he said sometimes they may have been at cocktail parties and other times it would have been on a more formal basis. How many conversations, to your recollection, did he have?
Well, they have 6 conversations with him in the on the logs of the books in the office.
At the Central Intelligence
Yes.
Agency?
Yeah.
Did he not sometimes come to your home, though?
Never. Never.
Bob, is that, have you ever laid claim to having met with Director Casey at his home or at his apartment?
Yes, I have, and as Mrs. Casey knows, she once served us breakfast.
That's true. One time we had a stag breakfast, and I went around and was helping out with the breakfast, and Bob was there, and he turned to me and he said, "I'm Bob Woodward." That was the first time I ever met him.
All right, we're going to take a brief break, and we'll continue our conversation with Bob Woodward and Sophia Casey in just a moment.
Women and love. Find out what they desperately want.
I think passion doesn't die, it gets killed.
Watch 2020 Friday.
It's a pleasure. Leave it to Beaver.
Tomorrow on Good Morning America.
Continuing our discussion now with Bob Woodward and Sophia Casey. Mrs. Casey, I think understandably people have been reluctant to push you on this, and forgive me if I do push a little harder, because after all, a man's reputation, your husband's reputation is at stake, but so is Bob Woodward's reputation. We heard you in the introductory piece say your husband never talked to anybody about his work. He didn't talk to you even about his work. And yet, as you have just said, even by your own count, even by the agency's count, your husband met with Bob Woodward at the agency at least 6 times, and we have now established that he also met at your home with your husband at least once. Clearly, they weren't just talking about the weather. Why are you so insistent that your husband would not have talked to Bob Woodward about the agency and the agency's business?
Well, I'm saying that because I know he would not talk to Bob Woodward about the agency in any depth. My husband was a professional, and he wouldn't talk to Bob Woodward, who was not a professional.
And yet, it is argued, and I'm sure we will hear more of this later in this broadcast, that because Bob Woodward had so many and such excellent contacts at the CIA, Your husband may have been concerned, and indeed Gene Kirkpatrick suggested that your husband may have been concerned about getting his version of events onto the record, and that for that reason he would have talked to Mr. Woodward.
Well, I think he might have talked to Bob Woodward, but not in a serious vein. And I know he talked to him. I know when we'd go to public functions, Bob would be there, and he would come over and speak to Bill, and Bill was always, he was a very sweet, friendly man, and he would say, "Hello, Bob, how are you? How's the book coming?" And it was always in that vein that my husband talked to Bob Woodward.
But I mean, you weren't present at these conversations.
No, I was not, but I know his habits, and he wouldn't talk any other way with him. Do you think for 1 minute this man, that he would speak to Bob Woodward about the secrets of the CIA or give him any of that information that he has in his book? Why, that's ridiculous.
Who else was present at that stag breakfast that you spoke of?
I really don't know. I didn't know any of them. They were all, I think they were newspaper men or authors that had something to do with books.
Bob, did you ever meet at the Casey's home with Director Casey alone?
At his home alone, no, I did not.
But you met at his office with him alone? I mean, can you give us some kind of a sense of what these meetings were like?
I think perhaps we should go to those meetings and try to address the question that you posed at the beginning: why would he talk? Jeff Greenfield, in his piece, showed Casey speaking at the editors' convention. I believe that was in 1986. One of the things Director Casey said at that speech was he is worried about leaks, worried about classified information in the newspapers, on broadcasts, and that he personally was available for consultation. He wanted to talk to people who had stories to make sure that sources and methods were not damaged. This is not an unusual posture for a CIA director or an intelligence officer.
And yet, I would have to say to you, and clearly you wrote the book and you know it better than anyone, some of the things that you have him telling you or confirming to you clearly are damaging.
Well, I had and have lots of sources in that area. I got lots of information. He knew that. I would go to him, and as I say in the book, he was playing defense. He wanted to shape the story. And as he told me once, everyone says more than they're supposed to. I think he acknowledged that that happened to him.
Jeff Greenfield alluded to one other possibility, and I suggested it in the opening also. What if he was deliberately planting disinformation with you? What if he was deliberately trying to mislead you?
Well, sometimes he would deny things I knew were true. I think over the years he realized that when I came up with something, it was solid, and he would generally deal with it.
All right. We're going to take a break. Mrs. Casey, let me point out, as you know, we have a lot of other guests on this broadcast. If at any time during the broadcast you feel you would like to jump in with a comment or a question, please do. But we're going to take a break now. A little later, we'll be talking with two senators whose duties have included keeping an eye on CIA activities, Senator Patrick Moynihan of New York and Senator William Cohen of Maine. But first, when we come back, we'll be joined by two key CIA veterans who played a major role in shaping the agency's activities. Former director, Richard Helms, and William Casey's former deputy director, the CIA's old guard who rose through the ranks to become its director in the late 60s and early 70s. He is one of those whom William Casey consulted when Casey became the man in charge at the CIA. Admiral Bobby Inman, joining us from our affiliate KVUE in Austin, Texas, was for a time second in command under Casey, primarily because influential senators like Barry Goldwater trusted Inman and wanted him in that post. Inman resigned in 1982, according to Bob Woodward, because of disagreement with Casey over support for the Contras, among other reasons. Gentlemen, and I guess I address the first question to you, Ambassador Helms. It seems that periodically now, over the last 20 or 25 years, we have a situation where people in the administration, at the Central Intelligence Agency, in the White House, feel frustrated, feel they can't get things done through conventional means, and start looking for unconventional ways of doing it? Is it just inevitable that every few years we're going to go through that kind of cycle?
I would not have thought so. I realize that this business of off-the-shelf operations is a rather new idea that was brought up by Colonel North in his Iran-Contra testimony. I don't recall any time in the past when anybody was thinking of using off-the-shelf operations. Therefore, it seems to me that since this is the first time it came up, it doesn't mean necessarily there's going to be another time.
No, but I mean, you know, what Colonel North referred to as an off-the-shelf operation, I think what he was saying is that the director, in this case William Casey, wanted the freedom to operate without having to go through Congress, without necessarily even having to dot each I and cross each T with the White House, and therefore money was collected in rather unconventional ways. You're saying that never happened in the past?
Not that I am aware of, and I was there from the day the doors opened in 1947.
Admiral Inman, how is it possible that it happened this time? When I say how is it possible, I mean the CIA had been burned badly before. It had gone through those very painful hearings, the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s. I would have thought that even the prospect of something like that occurring again would have been enough to set off all kinds of gongs and alarms at the agency.
Ted, when covert operations are being conducted, very few people have access. It's not a process where a lot of people are involved and have the chance to set off alarms. But I would remind you that even with all our focus on the Contras or Iran, that there were other ongoing covert operations judged to be in the national interest, enjoying bipartisan support in the Congress, being funded through that bipartisan support in the Congress, and being conducted under the rules and regulations that have been clearly established after the Church Committee time.
No question about that, and clearly those are not the controversial issues at the moment. What is far more controversial, for example, and I know you haven't had a chance to read the entire book, but I'm sure you've read some of the excerpts in the newspapers and magazines, are the unconventional operations such as getting money from the Saudis, you know, to plant that car bomb in Lebanon, killing 80 innocent people, and trying, of course, to keep the CIA at arm's length from that. But now when this kind of thing comes out, that's going to do enormous damage, isn't it?
Oh, it clearly does enormous damage. And we saw that in the in much of the coverage, even as the hearings were going on, a great skepticism that CIA was not really involved. I think the evidence is now pretty clear that at least the overwhelming agency itself, leadership of the agency, was not aware of events that were being done offline. I would remind you, though, before we ever had a CIA, that back in our history, presidents have turned to private individuals to conduct services for them. General Donovan got started in his activities before there ever was an OSS. So this is indeed, from all I can see, an aberration in recent years. But it isn't the only time in our history that presidents have turned outside the government bureaucracy to get individuals to do foreign missions for them.
Ambassador Helms, is it inevitable that when a president wants action, as clearly President Reagan wanted action in Central America, as he wanted action with regard to the hostages being held in Beirut, is it inevitable then that ultimately folks are going to turn to the agency as being the action arm for that sort of thing?
I think that is inevitable. It is really the only agency in Washington that's equipped to handle such matters, that has unvouchered funds, that has the legitimacy through statute and so forth to conduct operations of this kind.
Does it make sense to you then that this kind of unholy alliance that appears to have existed between the agency and the National Security Council was equally inevitable when you have to keep things, or when there is the perception that you have to keep things away from Congress?
Well, I don't think that if I understood this arrangement accurately from the Iran-Contra hearings, it was because of the Boland Amendment that the agency was taken out of the game and the National Security Council got into it. And that's a most unusual situation. I don't know if it's ever happening before.
And yet, if Bob Woodward is correct, in point of fact, the agency was not out of it. The agency was very much in it. In fact, the Director of Central Intelligence appears to have been running the operation.
That may be. Whether he was running it out of his hip pocket, irrespective of the work of the agency, I really don't know, and I'm in no position to judge that.
Well, you've spent a lifetime, Ambassador Helms, learning to trust your nose and your gut. Does your nose tell you that this story is right? Does your nose tell you that it happened the way that Bob Woodward describes it?
I don't know how Bob Woodward described it because I haven't read his book, but I would assume that from the report of the Tower Commission and the Iran-Contra hearings and so forth, that Casey had a role in this whole affair.
Ted, could I break in for a moment?
Please, go ahead, Bob.
Before we keep rolling along here, in fairness to the person who we're talking about who is not here, Mr. Casey, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, as Mrs. Casey may remember in a phone conversation she and I had in June of this year when I called to offer my condolences to her, we talked about him and why he talked to me. And I said to her that he was a man, an absolutely extraordinary man, somebody as the years of the Reagan administration went on, I think we, including myself, did not fully realize his intellect, his passion, and his convictions. And one of the things I said to Mrs. Casey was, your husband never avoided the confrontation with me. If I had a story, if there was something I wanted to know about, not once did he not call me back, not once did he say, we can't meet. He was somebody, and sometimes those discussions, meetings were unpleasant ones, but he did it. Second point I want to make in fairness to him, there has been a kind of presumption by some people that Casey was the Daniel Ellsberg coming in with a grocery cart of documents to me or with a lot of secrets. That's absurd. At the beginning, Tom Powers talked about the mosaic. You piece together these stories. Casey was willing to deal with me. He was willing to cross some lines, to explain, to give his side. But I think he was not, in fact, I know he was not Daniel Ellsberg.
Mrs. Casey, any comments you want to make?
Well, all I can say is that I agree with Bob Woodward that my husband was a very friendly man, but he would never, his friendship didn't go that far, that he would give him CIA information that would be harmful to the agency.
All right, we'll take a break again, and when we come back, we'll be joined by two senators who played a crucial role in overseeing CIA activities, but who may have found some surprises in the Woodward book. Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York and Republican William Cohen of Maine.
There are, however, precautions you can take against the spread of AIDS. For information, call the AIDS hotline at 1-800-AID-AIDS.
Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York was vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, but resigned in protest over the CIA mining of Nicaraguan harbors. He joins us in our Washington bureau. Also in Washington, Senator William Cohen of Maine, current vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator Cohen came close to disaster on a flight into Managua when he and Senator Gary Hart landed there just hours after a CIA-sponsored bombing attack on the airport. Senator Moynihan, much of what is in Bob Woodward's book, clearly to you as a former vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, cannot be new. But it is, for the first time, public. Is it good that it is public, or should it have remained private, behind the scenes?
The episode to which you refer, and which is dealt with in great detail by Bob Woodward, the decision to mine the harbors in Nicaragua, the decision not to tell the Congress, the inevitable discovery by the world that this happened, the feeling by Senator Goldwater that he had been betrayed, the statement by the NSC official that Mr. Goldwater saying he hadn't been informed was wrong. in effect, dismissing Mr. Goldwater's statement that this is a violation of international law, my saying if they're going to call Barry Goldwater a liar, I'm not going to carry their water any longer. All that is accurate, and much of it public. Mr. Woodward puts in details which I didn't know, but are coherent. And I would hope people would read it for the importance of what he describes, which is this. These weren't off-the-shelf operations, they were off the wall. You take to give an intelligence agency the capacity to carry out foreign and military policy independent of your State Department, your War Department, is to invite calamity. May I just make this point? Right now, in the Navy, I'm sorry, in the Persian Gulf, our Navy is been put in harm's way and is doing a hell of a job dealing with the Iranian mining of international waters and possibly territorial waters. And we've attacked an Iranian ship, we've seized that ship, we've seized its crew, and made the claim, correct in my view, that they were violating international law. Under international law, we have the right to do it and arguably the responsibility. That Navy would not have mined those harbors because they would know that in doing so, are acting a kind of an act of state terrorism, I'm sorry. They would undermine something very important to a maritime power such as ourselves, which is that law, which is not law does not restrain you, law empowers you, and the Navy would have thought more than 5 months ahead, and we would not be in the complex situation we are in now. They didn't.
Senator Cohen, I have to ask you, there is a clear paradox here. On the one hand, this man, Director Casey, who apparently felt that some of these operations were vitally in the national interest, on the other hand, then sharing some of his thoughts on that with Bob Woodward, knowing it was going to end up in the book. How do you, in your mind, reconcile those two realities?
Well, they're hard to reconcile. You indicated before that Pat Moynihan and myself might find some surprises in this book. I think the first and the biggest surprise is the fact that the conversations took place at all. Secondly, what is surprising is the number of conversations. I'd have to say to Bob Woodward that he had greater access to Bill Casey based upon those 50 interviews than most of us on the Intelligence Committee ever had. So I found that quite a rather stunning revelation. It is it is very inconsistent with Bill Casey's own attitude toward the press. I think it's very clear that he had a great deal of hostility not only toward Congress as a general proposition, but even more so toward the press, and even at one point considered bringing a lawsuit against either Bob Woodward or the Washington Post because they were digging too deeply into some of the nation's secrets, and he had general support in that proposition, I must say. So it's rather inconsistent that he would talk to Bob Woodward at all.
Looking at the book inductively, if you will, I mean, taking a look at what has been revealed, do you believe Bob Woodward? Do you believe, A, that he had all of those conversations, and does it strike you, from what you know, does it strike you as accurate information?
Well, I haven't read the entire book. I've only read the first 50 or 60 pages, but I do know from my readings of Bob Woodward's stories and the way in which he has conducted his investigative reporting, he's very thorough. And he doesn't begin a story without having his facts at least down fairly pat. He has never asked a question, to my knowledge, without knowing pretty much what the answer is going to be or what the answer ought to be. So I can't comment on his book and wouldn't comment on the details, but I would say the general proposition, he's been pretty thorough in his reporting.
Senator Moynihan, you're a politician by avocation, you're a historian by vocation, therefore apply your historical mind, if you will. What kind of impact is this book and its revelations going to have, positive or negative?
I would like to think, and I think Bill Cohen would agree with me, that we will see the dilemmas, the impossible dilemmas that take place when the major public policies of the nation in effect become secret, and the almost compulsive behavior, I have to think of that, of the man who held those secrets to tell somebody, even though he wouldn't, in these situations, share them with the Congress, which would be sworn to secrecy. Well, I can say to you, most of the things I read about the mining are true. I couldn't say it till now because we received them in confidence. But also, to be fair to Bill Casey, he wanted it to work. He realized when he'd made a great mistake. He came to me and asked me
please don't resign. This won't ever happen again. He and Senator Goldwater and I drew up an agreement, a written agreement saying, well, now in the future we'll be told about these things in advance and so forth. But then in the Iranian affair went and broke the agreement with our successors, Senators Durenberger and Leahy. It's a complex man, and I do not suppose a public democracy can conduct matters of such consequence in secret. That's what's good about democracy. It's out in the open. You know what you're getting, and when you get it, you can at least support a policy which having you've in the first place committed yourself to.
Gentlemen, we've got to take a break. We'll continue in a moment.
That pain, no wonder it's great on my awful headaches.
Nuprin. Discussion now with Admiral Bobby Inman. You were, for what, almost a couple of years, Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency under William Casey, but you quit. And the impression is that you quit because you didn't like the way some of these operations were being run and you were being cut out of the loop. That says something about where you stand on these issues, but maybe you would put it in your own language.
Ted, let me make 3 quick points. First, you'll recall that the first time I ever appeared on national television was on Nightline a little over 6 years ago.
To defend William Casey?
To defend Bill Casey when he was under some assault in the Congress for handling his finances. I have no regrets for that. I think he did many great things for the intelligence community while he was there. Second, I don't know how many conversations he had with Bob Woodward or in detail what he had to say, but I do know from looking at the first 100 pages of the book that there are some very specific details of conversations that I had with him, briefings I gave him at NSA, which he certainly Woodward didn't get from me. And he could only have gotten them either from a conversation with Bill Casey or from notes that Bill Casey made of those events that somebody else made available to him. Third, I must tell you that I have some difficulty in the larger view of this kind of book, with Bob Woodward's strong stand in his need to defend, protect at all costs sources that would have given him access to the DCI, yet the cavalier description of very sensitive U.S. sources and methods which clearly harm this country's ability over the long term to collect intelligence from many parts of the world. There may be, the Soviets may well have been aware of techniques being used, but the Soviets aren't the only country in the world where we need to use many of these sensitive approaches if this country is going to have warning of potential danger to its citizens, its forces, indeed its interests.
Bob Woodward, that's probably the most damaging charge, I suppose, that can be made against you. Not that that you cooked anything or that you didn't do an excellent job as a reporter, but that some of this material just shouldn't have seen the light of day.
Well, Admiral Inman says that there was a cavalier attitude toward it, just the opposite. I took a great deal of time, talked to many, many people, weighed the consequences, kept cutting back on detail. As he will tell you, he hasn't been there in about 5 years. A lot of things have changed. I talk about certain things in certain time frames. It is limited to that. I believe the CIA put a statement out to one of the papers here saying there is nothing in this book so far that has damaged an ongoing operation. I spent too much time with intelligence officers, people in the government, to not have deep respect for their work. I have attempted to be very careful. At the same time, overall, what the book is about is government, what happened in a 6-year period, and something very disturbing happened. I think everyone is willing to agree with that. And in order to make that and really paint the cumulative portrait, not only of Casey, but of the administration, you've got to not write a sanitized version. That is not a sanitized version. But I disagree with the Admiral on the idea that I would be cavalier.
Ambassador Helms, your thoughts on that. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I agree thoroughly with Admiral Inman. I think this kind of book does grave damage to U.S. interests abroad, particularly with our allies, and you can rely on the fact that there's a white snow of autumn paper falling on the agency right now from other intelligence services, from agents around the world and so forth, who don't trust us, who can't understand why we can't keep secrets, and how it is that all this comes out in the public prints. And I can assure you it is hurting our efforts, particularly in our fight against terrorism, where we need the collaboration of foreigners.
But don't we have to face what has gone wrong? That's, you know, all the books I've done, the reporting.
That's what we've got the Iran-Contra committees and all these committees of the Congress for, is to straighten out the things that have gone wrong. We don't need to go public.
Fair point, but ask the two senators, for instance. Don't they feel, in looking back at the Casey era, that to a certain extent he rolled them, that he thumbed his nose at them, and in fact, things were out of control?
That's an excellent question, and we're gonna let it hang for a moment while we take a break, and when we come back, we'll give Senator Moynihan and Senator Cohen a chance to answer that question. We'll continue in a moment.
ABC's Olympic Diary is brought to you by Northwestern Mutual Life.
Moving 200,000 families a year.
The old-fashioned way. Smith Barney, they make money the old-fashioned way. They earn it. No, they earn it.
Apology, first of all, to our affiliates. If you look at your clocks, you will already know what I'm about to tell you, and that is we've gone beyond our allotted time. We're going to go on for just another few minutes so that we give everyone a chance for a concluding thought or two. Senator William Cohen of Maine, just before we broke, the suggestion was made that what Director Casey was doing was rolling all of you fellows on the hill up. You have that impression?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that Bob Woodward said it was important to talk about what went wrong. But I think it's also important to point out what went right. And what went right is that the agency, for the most part during the period of the Casey years, did in fact comply with the law, did notify Congress, did trust covert activities to our review and indeed approval. And so I think that for 99% of the time, the agency ought to get credit for what took place and not be tarred with a brush by saying in the 1% of the cases, be it Nicaragua or Iran, where there were either off the shelf or sort of off the hip, as Ambassador Helms has described it, allow that to taint the agency in its entirety. Secondly, with respect to covert actions, I again point out that almost in every case, the covert activities were in fact revealed to the Congress, and we had an opportunity to pass judgment upon them, to give our advice with respect to them. The reason that Director Casey went in the direction of the diversion, if it's a diversion, was that the agency was not cooperating. He knew that the agency, the institution, would comply with the law by reporting to Congress, and therefore decided to take it around. So I think we ought to point to the positive side of things and not just the negative.
Senator Moynihan.
I think that's our problem, what Bill says. We can't tell you what went right. We had a fine and building and strengthening relationship with the agency. The strange thing is that Casey would withhold from us information that was available to others. And then inevitably we would learn about it. He'd come up, he'd apologize, say it won't happen again, then it would happen again. But please understand that the professional career officers found the relationship with Congress a good one, and wanting to maintain it is when they began to resist these programs that they knew we wouldn't think well of because they weren't going to work.
Admiral Inman, one of the curious things about this story is that when, after all, you put your secrets in the hands of foreign intelligence agencies or foreign governments, it is almost inevitable, is it not, that these things are going to come out here, too. So what's the percentage in ever doing that?
In actuality, Ted, we have been fortunate for many years to have relationships with other countries, exchanging intelligence, exchanging collection operations, doing things together, where they've kept the secrets even better in most cases than we have. So you can, in fact, enter into those arrangements and make them work. I take my hat off to Bob Woodward as one of the great investigative reporters we've seen in modern times. But I must tell you, even 5 years out of date, I'm not prepared to concede to him that he knows more about intelligent sources and methods than I do.
Ambassador Helms?
My only comment is that we have a real problem in the United States, and we Americans are all in this together. Our secrets are allegedly and specifically for the purpose of helping the national security of the United States. It seems to me that the dissemination of our secrets, the appearance in the world that we can't keep them, that we're, in a sense, irresponsible, is a most unhappy situation. And I would just simply like to submit an evidence that we may be so big, so rich, and so powerful that there's nothing that can really affect the national security of the United States, but I assure you that in the world of terrorism and low-intensity warfare, we need friends, we need agents, we need assistance, and this kind of revelation harms that effort.
May I break in, Ted, just for a moment?
Not only may you break in, I was going to ask you this question. Whatever you may have had in mind when you were writing this book, has it worked out that way? Is the initial reaction, both from public and the Congress and people like Ambassador Helms and Admiral Inman, does that surprise you, or do you feel that you have succeeded in doing what you wanted to do?
First, I want to concede to Admiral Inman that I do not know more about sources and methods than he. I was not saying that. I was saying I took great care with sources in government, in the intelligence agencies, and going through and making these decisions. I quite frankly and candidly think that it's time for a little bit of introspection by everyone involved in this, that I really disagree with Ambassador Helms very much, that somehow we can do it the old way and let's not face our problems.
We aren't doing it the old way, Bob. We've got two permanent select committees of the Senate and the House overseeing these activities now, and that ought to be enough.
Well, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, as I say in the book, oversight kind of fumbled along for a number of years in the Casey era and then failed. And I think the evidence is the Iran-Contra hearings. Here you have the CIA, as Senator Moynihan has pointed out very vividly, there was an agreement, a letter agreement with Bill Casey that all covert operations would be disclosed. The administration made their decision in the Iran arms sales. To hell with Congress for 10 months. I know a lot of people are upset about that, and what are they upset about? The issue's the law. Did we play by the rules and the law that has been set up? And unfortunately, the answer is we have not.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we must bring this to a close, and we bring it to a close. Mrs. Casey, I promised you during the break that if you had a closing thought or two, we would leave you the last word, so please.
Thank you, Ted. All I want to say is that in his book, Bob Woodward didn't portray the real Casey. What he has in his book is a figment of his invention and his imagination.
I know that was supposed to be your last statement, but I can't just leave it hang there. What do you mean by that? I mean, who was the real Casey if that wasn't he?
Well,
I realize every man is more than one dimension. You knew him as husband and friend, and Bob knew him only as, you know, on a very professional level. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about all the people that know Bill Casey don't think of him as Bob Woodward does. He was a very patriotic, fine public servant and a real professional in his job. And he would never stoop to give Bob Woodward any information that would hurt his agency or this country.
All right. I realize there is a temptation to constantly go back and forth again, but we have to end somewhere. We will end on that note. I'm very grateful to all of you, Mrs. Casey, obviously, for joining us this evening, and to Bob Woodward for joining us. And my thanks also to Ambassador Richard Helms and to Admiral Bobby Inman and to Senators William Cohen and Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. To all of you, my thanks for being with us tonight. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been ABC News Nightline, brought to you by AT&T. If you wish a printed transcript of this or any Nightline broadcast, please send $3 to Nightline Transcripts, 2 John Street, New York, New York, 10038. Nightline is a presentation of ABC News.
Looking for a job is never easy. Finding one is harder for those who lack basic literacy skills. Today, 1 out of 8 American workers can't read beyond a 4th grade level. America's future depends on our workers having the best possible skills. This fall, ABC and PBS will present programs that explore literacy in the workforce and what it means for our future, because we can no longer afford illiteracy in America.
Bill Sims, now that you're home on Sundays, what are you going to do?
My family and I are going to watch the Disney Sunday movie on ABC.
Good. This Sunday, watch The Journey of Natty Gann.